Aye. So in the time we have left, we wanted to chat with our panelists. I'll just take a second to introduce myself and then introduce our distinguished guests. And then we'll run through some questions. So my name is David Muller. I'm Dean for Medical Education. I oversee the MD program and share the MD PhD program with my counterpart in the graduate school. I've been at Sinai a little bit over 30 years since I was an intern. I did my internal medicine residency here and then stayed on, and a couple of colleagues and I started what's called a visiting doctors program. We take care of people who are homebound throughout Manhattan. And then I've been in this role in medical education for almost 20 years in the medical school. So it's been fun. It's a lot of hard work, as we all know. And it's been an absolute privilege for me to be part of the history of an institution like this. That dates back, of course, we know to the 1850s as a hospital, but as a medical school in a relatively short amount of time has changed the world. And that's really something very, very special, and you've all been a big part of it. So I want to welcome all of our panelists from the classes you can see kind of up on the cards, the tent cards. And I'll just say something quickly. Oh, you know what? We have till half an hour. So I'm going to dispense with some of the formality and maybe just go along the row here and ask that you say just a couple of things about yourself professionally, personally, to introduce yourself to the audience. I think it'll be more interesting and more fun than me reading off a bunch of bullets for everyone. Okay. So Dr. Grimm, if you can go first.
Okay, I'm Kathy Teets Grimm, and I transferred to Mount Sinai from Rutgers Medical School, which was also a brand new medical school. So my class at Rutgers started out at 16. There's two girls, me and my good friend Sandy Moss. And both Sandy and I transferred to Mount Sinai for our last 2 years of medical school. And it was my first time living in New York. I'm from New Jersey originally. But I always heard positive things about New York because my mother came from an immigrant family and they had lived in the South Bronx, and she only had good things to say about New York. So I love living in New York. And so I actually ended up doing my internship and residency at Johns Hopkins. And I was also there for 3 other years as chief resident of the outpatient department and on faculty. And I came back in 1978 to be in charge of the pediatric emergency room, which I did for roughly 20 years. And my job titles kept on increasing. So I was also vice chairman under Kurt Hirschhorn, and I was director of ambulatory care. And I was very much involved with the curriculum committee with Barry Stimmel, actually. And then I subsequently left Mount Sinai to join an agency that treats children who have been traumatized and also do forensic evaluations. Because when I came to Mount Sinai in 1978, I inherited the child protection program, which had been started by Dr. London, who unfortunately passed away, actually during a bypass procedure. So I was actually recruited to come back and take his role in the pediatric ER. And so with my involvement with this agency, I became certified as a child abuse pediatrician, even though I had done child abuse work all those years, but it's a sub-board now in the American Board of Pediatrics. And so I gave up my private practice a year ago and in general pediatrics, and I'm just doing child protection work here at Mount Sinai and also at my agency.
Please.
Steve Heymsfield. I'm currently a professor at Pennington Biomedical Research Center. That's in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And I've got a sort of checkered career. I'm not sure how to put all this together, but when I was at Mount Sinai, I was strongly influenced by Kurt Duschel in community medicine and Samuel Bosch. And they bonded with me quite well, and they sent me over to New York Hospital. There's a graduate student, physician scientist there, Scott Grundy, and he asked me if I'd like to go out to Phoenix, Arizona to open the Phoenix Indian Medical Center with him, which I did as an elective rotation for 3 months. And during that time, I made some discoveries doing the lab work related to cholesterol gallstones. And so they extended another 3 months, and I spent half a year in Phoenix with Grundy, and had my first New England Journal of Medicine paper by the time I started my internship, which was quite a shock to me. And then, so I was at Emory University, and from there I stayed quite a while. I developed my interest in metabolism, and I went up to Columbia University, where I stayed a good part of my career in nutrition and metabolism at St. Luke's Roosevelt Hospital. And by the time I reached my early 60s, I was known for weight loss drug development for a lot of the work I did. And I was recruited by Merck, where I took a position as global director of scientific affairs. We've heard comments about drug companies. I could rebut some of those. But so I was at Merck, and I reached the peak retirement age of 65. And I was recruited. I still could walk and talk at that point, so I figured, why not? And I was recruited by Louisiana State University to run the largest nutrition center in the world, Pennington Biomedical Research Center. I said, why not? And I did that for 3 or 4 years, after which I stepped down and I became a professor again. And then a couple of years ago, I got very involved in telecommunications and the types of devices like Fitbits and so on. And that came to the attention of Jeffrey Bezos, the owner of Amazon, or founder of Amazon. And he recruited me as an Amazon scholar. And I spent the last 2 years working in Silicon Valley part-time, developing these kinds of devices, which are now in many cell phones and people's wrists. So that's my career. It's been quite a journey.
Checkered.
Yeah, checkered.
Dr. Schaefer.
Yeah, my name is Ernst Schaefer, and I'm sitting here in place of someone who is much more distinguished than I am, Jeff Flyer. And when I was here at Sinai, I entered a bunch of competitions, and the guy that always won them was Jeff Flyer. And so when I got to be an intern, I was an intern with him here and a resident, and I understood why, because he was brilliant. And Jeff, of course, had a major career in diabetes. Both Jeff and I and Arthur were at the NIH together. And then Jeff became a professor at Harvard, made major discoveries in insulin action, and subsequently became the dean of Harvard Medical School. He's not here because of a family emergency. Both Jeff and I certainly were heavily influenced by a man here named Solomon Burson, who encouraged a lot of us to do research and allowed me to spend some time at Einstein and at Rockefeller, but unfortunately he had an untimely death of cardiovascular disease, actually, but would have won the Nobel Prize, in fact, for the discovery of the RIA for insulin. And in fact, Rosalind Yallow, his partner in research, did win the Nobel Prize in 1977. But Dr. Burson, I mean, this was a great hospital. So having a medical school here, I had come from Dartmouth, where in 1912, a guy came around from the AMA and said, well, this is a great medical school, but you don't have enough sick patients. You got to train elsewhere for the last 2 years. It then subsequently became a 4-year school. But Mount Sinai had great clinicians, but thanks to people like Dr. Burson, it also had a tremendous emphasis on research and encouraging people to do research, in my case, in cardiovascular at the NIH, and then at Tufts Medical. And then in 2007, I founded a lab called Boston Heart Diagnostics. So I'm going to now pass the baton on to my good friend, Arthur Frank.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ernie. There's all kinds of connections here as I've been listening to my colleagues. I believe I'm the only one on the panel that actually started as a first-year student here.
Yeah.
So that I bring that perspective as well. I had 2 great mentors here. I had Kurt Duschel, whose name you've heard already. He was chair of community medicine, a term that he actually founded or started when he was starting another new medical school at the University of Kentucky, which will come up in a minute. The other was Dr. Irving Selikoff, who was head of the Environmental Sciences Laboratory. And I believe at the time, Sinai, even though it was just starting as a medical school, probably ranked in the top 10 when compared to medical schools in the country in terms of research dollars. And at least for a while, Dr. Solikoff, I think, was the single largest recipient of outside funds when he was here. Steve, you asked about an MD PhD program. I believe I'm the first such MD PhD who graduated here at Mount Sinai. There was no formal program then. I had to be a medical student and a doctoral student, and managed to get those done. The second one took me a bit longer than is sometimes done now. But the connection, when you worked at the Indian reservation, Dr. Dushel had spent part of his early career working with the Navajo. And later in my career, I ended up having connections with that group as well. So I was in that first class. We met in I'll have to walk down the block and see if the old bus garage with the white marble cladding that was the Cummings building at the time is still there, and reminisce a little bit. We were here for the groundbreaking for the Annenberg building, and lived through those times as well. I stayed on here at the Mount Sinai Hospital, did my first year of internal medicine, left to go work in a research lab at the NIH. I'd done a 10-week elective there as a student. That had been arranged through here. So Sinai was always good about seeing that students had interesting opportunities. I joined the Public Health Service, a commission that I ultimately held for some 37 years, though most of it in the reserves, though I did some more active duty time with NIOSH, the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health, in the 1990s. I did my training in internal medicine, in occupational medicine. I then joined the faculty, spent 6 years here, and then unbeknownst to me, Dr. Dushel had shared my name with the University of Kentucky, which was looking to rejuvenate what had been their Department of Community Medicine, now called the Department of Preventive Medicine and Environmental Health. So at the fairly tender age of 36, I became a department head and started a brand new department in Kentucky. Built that up over 11 years, then became vice president for medical education at one of the University of Texas 6 medical campuses, and professor of occupational and environmental medicine. And for the last 21 years, I've been at Drexel University at the School of Public Health as a professor of medicine. And even though I have no engineering training, I work a lot with the environmental engineers, so I'm a professor of environmental engineering as well. I have a son who's an MD PhD who has a honest to God engineering degree, which I agree with Dr. Charney was not common in medical education for many years. He now does lymphoma work and is an oncologist, but has an MIT engineering degree. And so he said to me one day, "Dad, how could you be a professor of engineering? You don't know any engineering." I said, "You may have the degree, but I'm the professor." But I recognize that he has more than one leg up on me on that. I've had a fascinating academic career. I think that's what MD PhDs tend to do. My work has taken me literally all over the world. 36 trips to India. I leave for there again next week to train occupational physicians there. 20 visits to China. I've been doing research there since 1991. South America, Mongolia, much of Europe. Still working actively, still publishing. What I learned from Dr. Solikoff obviously was something about asbestos, and have carried on in that tradition, and have tried to bring public health to the fore, even though we're still fighting to get asbestos banned as a legal product in this country. 70 countries around the world have banned asbestos. We're the only industrialized country where it's legal to still use that stuff to kill people with. And have gotten involved with some colleagues and have had a role in Brazil banning it, in the country of Colombia and South America banning it, and spend part of my time, as I have for 45 years, going to court 99% of the time for injured workers or family members who've been injured, testifying in court, mostly over asbestos disease, but other occupational and environmental exposures. So again, a somewhat checkered career.
Thank you. Yeah.
A variety of different things, but there's not a day that goes by that Sinai and the education and the experiences I had here don't play a role in literally my day-to-day activities.
And it is so interesting to hear the difference between what the impression of a medical student is when they first start the process, which is, I'm going to come to medical school, I'm going to be a doctor. It's a pretty straight line to whatever the goal is going to be. And the reality is that most of us take a pretty winding path and would never have anticipated where we had ended up. So I'm going to go a little bit off script in terms of the questions I have, because I want to ask questions that more are related to things that have come up already. And before I do that, I think some of us have a red light still on the mic. If you hit your button, it should go green.
Thank you.
Okay. So one of the questions that came up was about diversity in all of its forms, ways, shapes, and forms. And that is something that we've been very focused on, as Dr. Charney said before, including creating pathways to medical school. He mentioned the Humanities and Medicine program we've had for the last 5 years, a special pathway, admissions pathway for folks from the armed forces. And so I imagine when each of you showed up here, whenever it is you showed up for first year or third year, I'm curious if there are any stories you have about the folks in your class, in your sort of first impressions of the people around you, or maybe even a story or two about people you met who are coming from unexpected places, however you might define that. So feel free. I think Dr. Schaefer, you're still red, so we're not going to call on you. There we go.
Okay. So actually, when I got here, Ken Edelson was my roommate. But after 6 months, I got married. But he was an interesting fellow. And our other roommate was Marshall Perlman, who was also a very interesting guy, and became a radiologist. But Ken, of course, is a big-time dermatologist, and also has made a lot of contributions and will make a lot of contributions to the school. So for me, Mount Sinai was terrific, because at Dartmouth in physical education, we were taught the WEED system, which was, there was a professor at the University of Vermont. He had to use this 100 item questionnaire. And by the time you were finished with the questionnaire, both the patient and you were asleep. So I get here, and Dr. Skleroff says, well, when you encounter the patient, first thing you ask is, what's the problem? And I could really relate to that. So this was a great clinical experience for us. And there were so many great physicians here. I don't want to enumerate all of them, but they were just, it was a great hospital. So certainly for the last 2 years, the clinical experience was really second to none.
Thank you. Dr. Heymsfield, I feel like you were, yeah, and Dr. Frank.
So I had a roommate, Eugene Kawaguchi, who was from Hawaii, and he was a real Hawaiian, and he had a lot of trouble adapting to New York. I had to tell him that shoes were important to wear, and I'm not kidding about that. So I think it was a really good example of how important it is to cultivate these kinds of diverse people. And it was very difficult for him coming to New York from Hawaii.
I already made the comment that we were a class that had more women than were usual at the time. Now more than 50% of medical students are women. More than 50% of law students are women now. So that's come a long way. But the fact that I'd been an anthropology major, somebody was an art history major, was pretty radical for those days, as was the early education here. They adopted what I guess had been started at Case Western, was subject matter teaching rather than organ system teaching rather than just subject by subject. So we had a pretty innovative kinds of educational program. And I think there's another comment that I'd like to make. The original name of Mount Sinai was the Jews Hospital. And while it is certainly a hospital that is no longer as strongly identified with that stripe and is certainly broadened out, there was still, 50, 55 years ago, this ethic that pervaded the institution. And I think the most important clinical lesson I ever learned, I mean, we learned how to take a good history, all of that. The lesson I've never forgotten was as a third-year student or second-year student learning physical diagnosis, my preceptor at the time simply said, treat every patient as if it was your grandmother. And that pervaded this place too, that the care was first rate.
Thank you.
I would say, well, as you know, our class was relatively small compared to what it is now. It was in the mid-30s. And, it was tough for the Hawaiians to adjust, because they weren't really used to the New York culture. And I think they were very happy to get back to the West Coast after they graduated. So I felt a little bit bad about that. And perhaps nowadays with all the teaching about cultural sensitivity and that, maybe it would have been handled perhaps a little bit better because they weren't used to the sort of assertiveness of people speaking up, and, the grade of honors is a very subjective grade. And I think it's probably still subjective. But, if you were able to speak up and ask good questions and give good presentations, you got brownie points for that.
Yeah,
And that
sure.
was really not part of their culture.
Yeah,
And they felt intimidated by that culture,
yeah.
And I felt bad about that.
Such good points. And it's interesting because we continue to push at those limits. In other words, who gets to go to medical school these days? So we've had for years now students who have DACA status, students who are refugees, of course, students who are first generation college grads or who are new immigrants to the country. And we really focus our energies on those future physicians. And I think we try to keep doing a better job. A year or two ago, we opened up a food pantry because we have students who come from very disadvantaged backgrounds and can't afford food all the time. So anticipating all those needs is a really interesting challenge. I also, every single one of you, when you sort of spontaneously introduce yourselves, almost to a person, talked about mentorship. And that was maybe, given the time, maybe the last question I wanted to put out there. Every one of us is exposed to mentors and or teachers who change our lives. I'm curious if there's a story you have to tell about, and I'm sure there are dozens of stories, but you're going to have to pick just one. And if we could start with you, Dr. Grimm, and then we'll work our way down.
Okay.
And
Well,
you.
my mentor was really Dr. Horace Hodes, who had a very interesting personality because underneath his surface, he was really soft and mushy, but he could be a little bit intimidating. This was very much part of the Mount Sinai culture in those days. People screamed and yelled and so on.
Yep.
But he was an amazing mentor, and he really encouraged me to go to Hopkins because he had been at Hopkins himself. And I kept in touch with him, and he recruited me to come back. And after I came back, having been at Hopkins, every other night, every other weekend, I felt like I wasn't doing very much when I came back. I came back for a year, and then I went back to Hopkins for 3 more years. So I came back as a pseudo-ambulatory fellow and I went and I complained to him. I said, I'm not busy enough. So he made sure that I was kept busy by giving me different jobs. But he was very special, and he actually came to my wedding. It was a long-term relationship. So I felt very blessed to have him as a mentor.
And he didn't scream at you at your wedding, I hope.
No, he did not.
Okay, good.
It was basically in conferences that he would get upset.
Sure. Dr. Heymsfield.
Well, I already mentioned community medicine and Kurt Duschel, but particularly Samuel Bosch, who was in that department, recognized that I had a research interest. I had never done research before I reached his desk. And he encouraged me to do a project riding the ambulance at Elmhurst Hospital. And that's what I did for that project. And I wrote it up. My first paper, so to speak. And he said, oh, I think you should meet the police chief of New York City, and which I did. And the police chief said, nice young man. Let's just put this in our drawer and not talk about it anymore. So they smoke marijuana on the ambulance? Oh, well, we'll just forget that. But but he was so kind, Bosch, and he's the one who really referred me to Scott Grundy, and that just changed the whole vector in my career, and I'll never forget that. So,
Thank you.
Yeah.
Dr. Schaefer?
Yeah, so I rotated through the coronary care unit, and there was a guy there, famous guy, Charles K. Friedberg, and he got a better history than I did. But there were 3 patients that died the first week I was there, and the care had been perfect. And so one of them had an autopsy, and he had severe diffuse atherosclerosis. So I asked Dr. Friedberg about the disease, and he said, well, why don't you go read about it? And so clearly high blood pressure, smoking, diabetes, but cholesterol was important. So I asked him about that, and he said, cholesterol, a lot of these patients have normal cholesterols. Of course, then we learned how it was carried. But then I went to see Dr. Burson, and he referred me to Dr. Eder at Einstein, and that led me to work at the NIH. And my major mentor was a man named Bob Levy, who ended up bringing me to Tufts as well, because he became the dean there. But he was the director of the Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute. But anyway, so for me, Sinai was a pivotal experience because I was here for 2 years as a medical student and then 3 years as a resident. And by the way, your predecessor, Barry Stimmel, also was wonderful to the students.
Yeah.
And he was a terrific guy, so we should remember Barry. Yeah.
Absolutely, agreed.
that's right.
Dr. Frank?
Again, there's many stories, but I'll try to weave a few into this. And, whatever horrible Horace, as he was known to the students.
Horrible Horace.
Yeah, everybody got their nicknames. So not everybody, I guess you earned, some were specially earned, but, turned Kathy into a first-rate clinician. And I need to recognize that she was our pediatrician and looked after our kids when they were born, our first 2 born by our twins here at Mount Sinai. And even that was an odd experience because Sinai was very late in letting fathers into the delivery room. It was not allowed. And I had to fight and went all the way to the Board of Trustees so that I could actually be in the delivery room. It was the first time that happened here. Another aspect. But I'll go back to Kurt Duschel because Kurt took me under his wing when I was a student, when I was a resident. And knowing that I would have a career in academics, an organization that we've seen a lot in the news lately again is the CIR, the Committee of Interns and Residents, that's making its noises around the country. Well, it started here in New York, and there was a section here at Mount Sinai, one of the first strikes, which meant that we would go down and picket, and then we'd go back upstairs and take care of our patients. The strike was ended when the surgical residents were told, if you miss any more time, we're going to certify that you haven't completely fulfilled your 5-year residency. You didn't have enough time. So that ended the strike, such as it was. But there was an active young woman who was busy in CIR, and the dean was unhappy about it. And I happened to be in Dr. Duschel's office when the dean called, and I only heard one end of the conversation, though Dr. Duschel filled me in on the other end. And he, knowing somebody that was going to go into academics, he mentored me, not just, as Selikoff did in the science, but in how to function in an academic environment, which is where one department head here had told me, young man, never want to be a department head because it's got all the headaches, just aim to be a full professor without all the headaches. I didn't listen to that. I've been a department head at 3 institutions. And another colleague who said, become an expert in something. It doesn't matter what that something is. If you become an expert in something, they think you know everything, which is clearly not true, but that's the impression the world gets. It was Dr. Duschel who brought a humanity to dealing with academic issues, because at the time, not only was there yelling and shouting, but there was even known to be the occasional fisticuffs between faculty, believe it or not. So one got to see all of that here. I think, this is an institution that is a microcosm of any first-rate academic institution. But the lessons learned not only in good care of patients, doing research, and making use of one's background in every which way. I mean, my anthropology background has served me well as I go literally around the world, brings perspectives that I might not have otherwise had. And it's nice to know that Sinai is fostering that in terms of the diversity and educating students, because it carries on not only to the diverse populations of New York, but the diverse populations of the world.
Absolutely. Thank you for that very much. And I have to say, because his name has come up so many times, that I had the privilege of taking care of Dr. Duschel for the last several years of his life in our home visiting program. And so please send my regards. Yeah, it's soaking up some of his wisdom and his grace over the course of that time. So
Before we finish, you brought something up that I just wanted to say, how unique Mount Sinai was. You transfer students, you know, but Arthur and Ernie were starting a system, in addition to the medical school not knowing what to do, bringing in international authorities that we couldn't understand, their accents were so thick. One thing they had that was brand new was that when we started as first-year students, we started on the clinical floor. Previously, it was like a religious experience being a doctor and training. You had your anatomy, you had your biochemistry, et cetera. Whereas we, right from the get-go, were on the floor. This was brand new. And this is one of the things that Sinai pushed right from the start and was one of the unique aspects of this medical school.
thank you for sharing that. It's interesting to see how that pendulum has swung back and forth over the ensuing decades, from early clinical exposure to not at all. When I was in medical school at NYU, we were explicitly forbidden from entering the hospital until the first 2 years were over. So a very different experience there. And there's some time to take questions from the audience, and certainly if there are other comments from our panelists before we wrap up. Molly?
Yeah. I'm Molly Seegers. I'm the director of Panelists Archives. Taking over from Barbara Ness. Oh, thank you. Thanks. And I just wanted to say how excited I am to be here with all of you today. And it's my great honor and privilege to steward the school's history. And we have all the papers of Dr. Duschel and Selikoff, and it's an absolute honor. So I, as a kind of the university archivist question was, what in your time do you think so as archivists, we're always talking about the past, but we're preserving it for the future. So what do you want the future to know about the beginnings of your experience here, the beginnings of the school, what was unique and how that affected your career? You've touched on it several different ways, but what do you want the future to know?
I could make a quick comment, and that is the medical school was only 2 years old when my class started, or 1 year old really, and we had the most world-class faculty. So having tried to start a medical school myself, it's not an easy process, and it's very hard to build a faculty. So how did Mount Sinai put together people like Selikoff or Gutman or Popper, all these people were so world-class? How did that happen?
Oh, there's a history to that. I mean, others may want to comment, but, you know, talking to Dr. Aufsis, for example, he had trained at Columbia, but you know, couldn't get a surgical residency there. There was still a limitation at the more traditional medical schools about taking Jewish doctors. And it's interesting, all the names you've mentioned, you know, and many, not all, but most of the faculty here early on, you know, had come out of that tradition. They had other places that wouldn't take them for training, and they were not made welcome at the other institutions. That, by and large, has changed. It's not entirely gone, but, you know, the fact that this place started as the Jews' hospital, it was also the Jewish doctors' hospital. And so all the great people you had train you and train me were of that ilk. And I think that's part of it. And the comment I wanted to make for the archivist was, and it's nice to know that there's this formal humanities program and such, but the humanistic aspect of what this school was and still seems to be is one that should be highlighted in any sort of history of this place, that it was founded on Jewish traditions and that there was a humanity to it that didn't always exist at other places.
There was a culture too.
Yeah, it was part of the culture.
Saul Barson was a great violinist.
Yeah.
Yes.
And there was an orchestra formed by members of the hospital.
I think the other thing that's important to remember is that people love to teach. And so, sometimes you can have a world-class researcher, but they find students to be sort of more of an annoyance, and especially also when you have a senior physician who also sees private patients, and that's the way they garner their salary, by the number of private patients they see. Sometimes students are an annoyance. And I think we were very blessed because, the school was new, there was a lot of enthusiasm, people loved to teach, and I think that we had an amazing education. And you remember those big, thick books we used to get that the faculty put together?
Yeah.
These were not textbooks, these were like things the faculty had put together that we should learn from. It was really very, very special. And, and we hope that the tradition continues. The class now is much larger, but I know when my practice was still open, we used to love having third-year medical students come and precepting them because that's, I received that blessing. I'd like to pass it on to other students as well.
There's a history there as well that again, I'll be the only one that knows it from literally the first week of school. This school was open and there was an ABC grading system. We were talking about how do you get an honors grade? And if you got to remember the time, we started here in the fall of 1968. Think of what the world was like then. It was the Vietnam War. Our class put out the first yearbook. There's pictures of us as a class protesting the war, that kind of thing. But we walked in and we had a wonderful relationship with the then dean, George James, who was the first dean. Unfortunately, he passed away before we could graduate, which was really sad because he was he was the president of the institution, but he was also the dean, and he was really close to our class being the first one. But we had asked for two things. Those big books you got were syllabi. We asked for syllabi. And the line that we used when we asked for that, it says, we want to know what's the core of medicine. There's a lot of fluff and stuff. What's the core? And he said, yeah, I understand that. But he says, remember, it's like an apple. He says, what's the core today is the garbage tomorrow. Things do change, how do you treat hypertension that we heard about this morning? We used to keep people with heart attacks in bed, not moving for 2 weeks. Now we get them out of the chair and walking the first day. I mean, things change, you don't treat ulcers with milk, you treat it with antibiotics now. I mean, this is, the core today is tomorrow's garbage. So there was that. So that's how we got syllabi. The other thing is we asked, in those days, I mean, people forget there was this kind of history. When you started medical school, the dean of the school on the day one would look and says, look to your right, look to your left. One of the three of you will not be here at graduation. Sinai had the idea everybody should graduate. And so we picked up on that. And so we said, look, instead of competition among ourselves, how about we have a pass-fail system that will help each other so that we all pass? And that needs to be reflected. And that literally was changed from an ABC system that first week to a pass-fail system. And then it was honors pass-fail for the clinical years. But this was a time of activism, and, there really was a role for that 36 of us who started that first week in September of '68 to mold the early days of this school, and still 50 years later, it's still got some of those changes that we wrought that first week.
Yeah, and I think that one of the, at least to me, one of the most important aspects has been the ability to maintain a close tie between the administration and the students. Have regular contact with them, and when they speak, we listen. We don't always do what it is that they'd like us to do, but when things like that come up, suggestions, recommendations, requests, sometimes even couched as demands, you try to hear the kernel of truth in what they're advocating for, and then run with that, as opposed to a lot of other institutions where they don't, either the students have no access at all, or the access is really just one way, and it's not this great two-way relationship. So, yeah.
One short comment. I know time is short, but over at what used to be St. Luke's Hospital, now Mount Sinai West, there's a woman named Norma Braun, who you probably know. And one thing I was struck by, I was over there not too long ago in honor of Ted Van Italy, who was one of Steve's mentors and a good friend of mine. I lived across the street from my summer house in Old Lyme, Connecticut, home of Lyme disease. That's my hometown. But over there, they have all these plaques and they have all these exhibits of people at that institution that made major contributions. And when we were here, there were so many great people, Burl Crone, Janowitz, you heard about Selikoff, Alan Guttmacher, any number of people. Those are people that should be honored because of their major contributions. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Luckily, we have phenomenal archivists who steward those histories.
Yeah. And Saul Burson, he was a giant. He was a giant. Yeah.
Any other questions? Oh,
Oh,
yes.
just a comment about the culture during the time that Arthur mentioned. Martin Luther King was assassinated April 1968. I was a student at the University of Tennessee doing radiology when they brought him in. And so 3 months later, Robert Kennedy was assassinated. And the summer we started was the Woodstock Festival. It was an incredible cultural time, very intense, right?
And more than that, they were actually, it was a revolutionary time. And one sensation was that we realized that the faculty were a little scared of us.
Yeah.
And we liked that.
Well, you did, right?
No.
You were an intimidating guy.
The funny story was about that. On that very first week of school, we started on Monday. We had gotten in touch with the dean's office and met with him Friday morning. He invited the 36 of us who were the first year class up to his office for coffee and Danish at 8 o'clock in the morning before our 9 o'clock class. Word zipped around the hospital. The students were having a sit-in at the dean's office. It had been an invitation, thank you. You know, we were not storming the dean's office. And again, just as you said, David, you know, you don't give in to everything. One of the other questions that we asked of him, which he acceded to right away, with one exception, we said, we'd like to be on all the committees here. And he looked at us and he said, okay, there's like, you know, a bunch of committees. You can be on all the committees you want here, except appointments and promotions. That should stay a faculty-run committee. And somebody spoke up and said, well, why can't we be on that either? And he gave what I call the famous cookie jar speech. He says, look, I've got 10 cookie jars in front of you. You can have cookies out of 9 of them. You just can't have the 10th one. Isn't that good enough? And so we agreed, and APT, you know, stayed a faculty committee, but we served on all kinds of committees, the library committee, the animal care committee, the curriculum committee, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, so it's.
Can I just say something about Arthur? We all had lectures. Arthur was the only student who would fall asleep in the front of the auditorium while the guy was giving the lecture, and he would nod off it. And then the guy would ask Arthur a question, and he'd wake up, answer the question, and then start nodding off again. It was like he was famous in our class for doing that. Anyway.
I think there was a,
I'll stop there.
there was a question from the, yes, sir.
I'm a member, Ron Podell, a member of the class of 71. Something that's unique about Sinai, or at least seemed to be back then, were the medical rounds, because we had 3 attendings. You know, there would be a cardiologist, a gastroenterologist, and maybe a hematologist, whatever. and they would argue with each other, as you guys have noticed. And it was very interesting. I went from there to a gentlemanly Southern school at Duke, and there it was sort of like, oh, you didn't read the article in the New England Journal of Medicine? So, I mean, that was just very special.
Yeah, I agree with that.
And this was,
Also, we had a yearbook, 71 had a yearbook too.
yeah.
Oh, you did?
Yes,
yeah.
and there's a picture of me sleeping in it.
And this was the only hospital at the time, or the only, when we were house officers or students, was the only place that had rounds, attending rounds only 5 days a week. There were no, I mean, you still had rounds on Saturday and Sunday, but it was without the attendings, which most places had 6 and even 7 days worth of rounds. I don't
Sure.
know if that's still the tradition here. The other nice tradition, because, there's 3 levels of trainees. First, what we used to call interns, first year, second year, and third year. The third years ran the floor. The interns did all the work. The second years were superfluous, except for doing some of the teaching and taking night call every 3 nights. So the most important thing the second year resident could do is organize the Friday lunches. You hit up those 3 attendings for money, and rounds on Friday was with lunch. And you'd either get a deli lunch or pizzas or whatever, and you would have you wouldn't make bedside rounds so much on Fridays. You talk about the cases. I mean, it really was educational, but it was very gentlemanly over a nice lunch with the attendings and the students, and it was a nice way to sort of end the hardest part of the work week. And then, you might be on duty Friday night or Saturday or Sunday, but you were much more on your own. The other thing that really has changed, I mean, Kathy was talking about Dr. London in the ER. We had no attendings in the ER. We as interns saw the cases. If you had a question, you'd ask the resident. And if you really needed something, you'd call the fellow on call for that specialty. To call an attending, that's something that wasn't done. Now, attendings are, part of the life of an emergency room.
Yeah.
And I remember getting called in to Dr. London, who was a pediatrician, but ran all the emergency rooms. And he says, "Do you remember such and such a case?" And I, no. And he gave me a little fact. Oh yeah, it was like 4 weeks earlier. And he was really stern. And I thought, oh my God, what did I do wrong? And he smiled at me and he said, "You did everything right, but the system let her down, et cetera." My notes had been good. But the attendings, if you had to deal with an attending, it put the fear of the Lord in you at times.
Sure. So I'm going to end with the theme of food. Those Friday lunches became Friday bagel breakfast. So when I was a resident here, the tradition became the attendings would chip in, and rounds would be not at the bedside, in the conference room, bagels and all the trimmings. And that went on for years and years. And so dinner tonight also, since we're talking about food. No, not bagels tonight, for sure. But looking forward to seeing you all at the dinner reception tonight, and then other events over the course of the week. Thank you very much to the panelists, to the audience. It was absolutely a pleasure to hear all these stories and reminisce with you together. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.